How does a tropical rainforest run out of water? And why is that drying puddle suddenly holding the entire global economy hostage? This is Critical Path, where we explore stories and innovations about our global supply chain that connect our world to your everyday life. Picture a traffic jam spanning 50 miles. But this is not your average Tuesday morning gridlock on a suburban highway. This traffic jam is composed entirely of massive skyscraper-sized vessels. These are the colossal behemoths of the sea, loaded to the absolute brim with everything you can possibly imagine. We are talking about children's toys, critical solar panel components, and life-saving insulin, all sitting completely motionless. And the weirdest part? This massive logistical gridlock is not occurring on a busy coastal highway, and it is not happening in a congested urban harbor. It is happening right in the middle of a lush, vibrant, tropical rainforest. Global trade is currently facing a high-stakes, seemingly impossible dilemma. The Panama Canal, the world's most crucial maritime shortcut, is quite literally running out of water. Honestly, it sounds like a paradox straight out of a really bad dystopian screenplay. Think about it. Panama is a country famous for its tropical deluges, its record-breaking rainfall, and its incredibly lush green canopies. It is one of the wettest places on Earth, yet suddenly, it is entirely too dry to float a boat. The Panama Canal functions as a giant, water-powered elevator that has operated beautifully for over a century until the sky suddenly stopped paying the utility bill. For the very first time in human history, the massive, trillion-dollar juggernaut of the global economy is finding itself held hostage by the local weather patterns of a single, 50-mile strip of land. The canal manages nearly 6% of all global maritime commerce. It serves as the vital, irreplaceable bridge between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. When the Panama Canal stutters, the global supply chain experiences severe tremors, pushing consumer prices higher across the board and forcing logistical networks everywhere to rethink their entire strategy. The core of this massive problem lies in the fact that, unlike sea-level canals like the Suez Canal over in Egypt, the Panama Canal relies entirely on freshwater lakes fed by rain to operate its intricate system of locks. The stark realization that global supply chains are currently at the absolute mercy of a drying puddle down in Central America has forced economists, engineers, and shipping magnates into a frantic scramble to completely rethink the future of logistics. The challenge of moving massive, heavy ships across an entire continent without depleting the drinking water of millions of citizens presents one of the most complex engineering and environmental riddles of the modern age. And resolving this crisis is not just an academic exercise, it is a matter of absolute survival for global commerce. Failure to figure this out would mean adding weeks of travel time and billions of dollars in fuel costs to the basic products the world relies on every single day. To really understand the sheer absurdity and brilliance of the canal, we have to talk about gravity. The Panama Canal is essentially a giant water-powered elevator for megaships. To lift a colossal vessel 85 feet over the continental divide, the canal operates a series of locks that act as massive liquid chambers. A ship enters the chamber, the massive steel gates slowly close behind it, and then gravity pulls fresh water from inland lakes into the lock. This lifts the colossal ship exactly like a rubber duck sitting in a bathtub. Once the ship reaches the level of the artificial Gatun Lake, it sails across the isthmus, only to repeat the exact same process in reverse on the other side to be gently lowered back down to sea level. It is a brilliant, century-old design that relies on the simplest, most indisputable rule of physics. Water flows downhill. Gravity does all the heavy lifting for absolutely free, which, in the modern economy, has the distinct advantage of being entirely immune to the unpredictable whims of inflation. But this ingenious design was not actually the first choice. Oh no, the first attempt was a spectacular, tragicomedy of hubris. Enter Ferdinand de Lesseps. He was a charismatic French count who had just spearheaded the successful construction of the Suez Canal. He swaggered into Panama in 1880 with unbridled overconfidence after his success in the Egyptian desert. He attempted to apply his exact same Suez Canal playbook to Panama, apparently believing that a flat, dry desert was exactly the same as a tropical mountain range. The French engineering strategy was effectively to dig a giant ditch through a mountain range at sea level during a perpetual hurricane while being eaten alive by disease-carrying mosquitoes. De Lesseps stubbornly refused to listen to any of his engineers and insisted on a sea-level canal, entirely rejecting any plans that involved tunnels or locks. The results were catastrophic. The French company excavated millions of cubic yards of earth, but every rainy season brought devastating mudslides that violently undid months of grueling labor. The attempt ended in a truly spectacular bankruptcy, costing the lives of an estimated 22,000 workers, primarily losing their lives to yellow fever and malaria. The financial scale of the French disaster was simply staggering for its era. To put the sheer audacity and subsequent failure of the French attempt into perspective, let us look at the numbers. In the 1880s, the Eiffel Tower was completed successfully for an estimated cost of around 8 million francs. The French Panama Canal attempt cost well over 1 billion francs, and all they got was a spectacularly bankrupt, muddy ditch. It was an epic financial collapse. It took the American engineers in the early 1900s to finally realize that fighting nature at sea level was a complete fool's errand. They decided to harness the awesome power of nature instead by damming the Chagres River and creating the artificial Gatun Lake, which sits 85 feet above sea level. By raising the ships using those massive locks, they saved thousands of lives and successfully completed one of the absolute wonders of the modern world. The canal opened in 1914, costing hundreds of millions of dollars, but it worked flawlessly. However, this incredibly ingenious solution created a heavy, relentless dependency on freshwater that literally no one in 1914 could have predicted would become the canal's Achilles heel exactly a century later. Every single ship that passes through the canal requires massive, mind-boggling quantities of water to operate the locks, and that precious water is eventually dumped directly into the oceans. Let us break down the sheer magnitude of the liquid consumption required to keep the global supply chain moving. The original Panamax locks, which are 110 feet wide and 1,050 feet long, use an average of about 52 million gallons of freshwater per single transit. Decades later, they built the massive Neo-Panamax locks, which are 180 feet wide and 1,400 feet long, and those also managed to use a net of about 52 million gallons per transit. On a completely normal day with about 38 to 40 transits, over 2 billion gallons of fresh water flow straight out of the lakes and into the salty sea. Let me repeat that, 2 billion gallons of fresh water. This massive volume of water is roughly twice the daily consumption of the entire city of New York. Imagine the entire population of New York City, brushing their teeth, taking showers, boiling pasta, running through fire hydrants, and then double it. That is what the canal spits into the ocean every single day, just to move cargo. Historically, this massive daily drainage was never actually an issue because Panama is one of the wettest places on Earth, normally receiving heavy tropical deluges that easily, reliably replenished the lakes. However, when the sky violently stops providing the expected deluges, the magical water-powered elevator starts to run out of hydraulic fluid. And that brings us to the perfect storm of recent years. The crisis was not just a sudden, unpredictable fluke. It was the devastating culmination of a double whammy involving a very strong El Niño event paired with record-breaking global warming. El Niño is a natural climate fluctuation that brings warmer than average air and ocean waters to the west coast of the Americas, and it very often results in prolonged, punishing dry spells right across Central America. In October of 2023, the rainfall around the canal was 43% lower than average, making it the driest October since the 1950s. The year 2023 officially went down as one of the 2 driest years in the canal watershed's entire recorded history. As global temperatures climbed to terrifying record heights, the evaporation rates across the tropical lakes soared, further depleting the already precious reservoir. With significantly less water arriving from the sky and far more water escaping upwards into the atmosphere, Gatun Lake's water levels plunged to unprecedented, terrifying lows. The projected water levels at the largest and most important artificial freshwater lake, the exact lake that makes passage through the Panama Canal physically possible, reached their absolute lowest point since the Panama Canal Authority began meticulously recording data back in 1965. By January of 2024, the lake's water levels were lower than in any other January on historical record, standing almost 6 full feet lower than they had just 12 short months prior. The system was violently pushed past its physical limits. To keep the vital waterway functioning during the peak of this devastating drought, the Panama Canal Authority had to impose strict, painful operational limits. The dramatic shift from standard operations to full crisis mode necessitated swift and incredibly severe restrictions. The historical standard of 36 to 40 daily vessel transits dropped drastically to just 22 to 24 ships. This caused incredibly severe port congestion worldwide. Furthermore, the maximum allowed draft for ships was severely reduced. Now, to visualize the impact of draft restrictions, a ship's draft is simply the distance between the waterline and the bottom of the hull. Historically, the maximum allowed draft was a generous 50 feet. During the crisis, this was forcefully reduced to 44 feet. When the allowable draft drops from 50 feet to 44 feet, massive container ships are forced to physically unload cargo or carry significantly fewer containers so they can float higher in the shallow, depleted water. For a standard Neo-Panamax container ship, simply reducing the draft down to 44 feet results in a staggering 40% cargo capacity loss. Shipping lines suddenly found themselves operating half-empty vessels while still paying the exact same massive overhead costs. Because shipping companies hate losing money more than nature hates a vacuum, they were aggressively forced to impose hefty transit surcharges on their customers. The Mediterranean Shipping Company started slapping on an additional surcharge of $297 per container on the base spot rate. Hapag-Lloyd added an extra $130 per container. These costs, of course, trickle right down the supply chain to you and me. But beyond the massive, swirling vortex of global commerce, there is another incredibly heavy demand placed on this finite body of water. Gatun Lake and its surrounding watershed are not just a convenient tool for maritime shipping. They serve as the absolute primary source of drinking water for over half of Panama's entire population, including the sprawling, bustling capital of Panama City. The country suddenly faced a profound moral, political, and operational dilemma. Do the authorities prioritize the daily profitable passage of ships carrying consumer goods, or do they ensure that millions of local citizens actually have clean water to drink? Legally and constitutionally, the canal is absolutely required to prioritize human water consumption above canal operations, meaning that when the water gets scarce, it is the profitable shipping lanes that must legally bear the brunt of the sacrifice. With daily transits cut significantly and the water dropping, the global shipping world rapidly devolved into a high-stakes, multi-million-dollar game of maritime musical chairs. For companies carrying incredibly time-sensitive cargo, waiting weeks at anchor was simply not an option. Perishable goods like fruits and vegetables can spoil rapidly, potentially resulting in a complete and total loss of freight and profit margins if they are delayed by even several days. The Panama Canal Authority capitalized on this absolute desperation by holding daily, cutthroat auctions for any unfilled transit slots. Normal reservation fees are already measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is already a staggering amount of money. But during the absolute peak of the drought, the bidding reached truly eye-watering, jaw-dropping heights. The financial scale of these auctions made typical, everyday maritime operations look like pocket spare change. The absolute record auction bid peaked at a mind-bending $3,975,000. This record was set by a Japanese liquefied petroleum gas carrier, operated by the Ineos Group for a ship called the Sunny Bright. This means that after you add in the standard, everyday transit fees, the company spent nearly $4.5 million for a single, 50-mile passage through a jungle. For $4.5 million, an average observer might legitimately expect the Canal Authority to throw in a complimentary, premium car wash and a very large, soothing scented candle. Such monumental premiums effectively priced smaller ships and lower-value commodities out of the canal entirely, as bulk operators absolutely cannot absorb such monumental spikes in their daily operating costs. When a massive ship cannot pass through the Panama Canal, it cannot simply pull a quick, convenient detour through a side street. The alternative routes are incredibly long, staggeringly expensive, and logistically painful. For ships carrying cargo from Asia to the United States East Coast, the canal has historically been the unquestioned gold standard of efficiency. When forced to find alternatives, many operators have to look to the long, grueling voyage all the way around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, or they have to brave the notoriously treacherous passage through the Strait of Magellan way down at the tip of South America. Data compiled by industry analysts from McKinsey illustrates the massive, disruptive scale of this logistical rerouting and its financial consequences on global trade. The affected cargo volume was approximately 100 million tons, which is roughly 35% of the entire 2022 volume. This massive diversion resulted in an approximate 5% increase in total ocean transport costs, or roughly an extra $1.1 billion annually. The journeys suddenly took about 20% longer, adding an average of 4 grueling days at sea. Analysts projected roughly 2,000 transits annually diverting to the Cape of Good Hope, mostly dry bulk and roll-off ships, and another 1,000 transits diverting to the Strait of Magellan, largely consisting of dry bulk and chemical tankers. These extra days at sea aggressively consume vast amounts of heavy fuel, adding significantly to global carbon emissions and wildly driving up transportation costs that are inevitably always passed down to the final consumer at the checkout counter. To make matters infinitely worse, this freshwater crisis in the Western Hemisphere completely coincided with extreme explosive volatility over in the Middle East. Security threats in the Red Sea violently forced many major carriers to avoid the Suez Canal at the exact same time the Panama Canal was operating at heavily reduced capacity. This simultaneous, terrifying choking of two of the world's most absolutely critical maritime corridors aggressively exposed the terrifying fragility of the global supply chain, proving definitively that international trade is heavily dependent on just a few precarious geographic choke points. When both of these major canals stutter at the same time, ships are forcefully pushed onto the open ocean for weeks on end, aggressively tightening global shipping capacity and causing spot freight rates to violently double on certain key critical routes. Now, as brilliant engineering minds frantically scrambled to find ways to keep the massive ships moving without draining Gatun Lake completely dry, a fascinating and deeply counterintuitive twist rapidly emerged regarding the canal's newest and most advanced feature. It is called the Great Salinity Trap, and it is a masterpiece of unintended consequences. In 2016, the Panama Canal completed a massive, multi-billion-dollar expansion project, officially costing $5.25 billion. This introduced the massive Neo-Panamax locks, specifically built to accommodate megaships large enough to carry up to 14,000 containers. Because these new locks are significantly larger and naturally require even more water to lift the colossal ships, the engineers cleverly installed a brilliant, state-of-the-art system of water-saving basins. These 18 storage basins were specifically designed to efficiently recycle 60% of the water used in each and every transit. On paper, in a boardroom, this was hailed as an absolute masterpiece of sustainable design. It reduced net lockage consumption beautifully. Then comes the massive, terrifying aha revelation that completely upends the entire perspective on the canal's sustainable future. The very mechanism built to save the canal from crippling water shortages ends up aggressively contaminating the vital drinking water of the local population. This deeply paradoxical turn of events is entirely driven by a hidden, simple mechanism of basic fluid dynamics. Salt water is significantly denser, and therefore heavier, than fresh water. In the original century-old locks, water is pulled directly from the lake and then violently discharged into the sea, ensuring a safe, one-way flush that successfully minimizes the amount of dense ocean water mixing with the fresh inland lake. However, the shiny new Neo-Panamax locks utilize those 18 storage basins that cleverly drain water from the lock chamber and then efficiently pump it right back in for the very next ship. Because denser, heavier salt water naturally settles at the absolute bottom of the giant lock chambers, the water that fills the recycling basins is unfortunately taken directly from that bottom layer, where the heavy salt has settled. Every single time the recycled water is moved back and forth between the massive locks and the water-saving basins, it greedily slurps up that dense, heavy salt water and strongly concentrates it at the base of the entire system. When the massive steel gates eventually open to let the ships carefully sail into the freshwater Gatun Lake, this heavily concentrated, toxic brine sloshes directly into the lake's delicate ecosystem. The ultimate, tragic paradox is that using the water-saving basins to allow more ships to cross directly and violently compromises the precious drinking water supply of millions of everyday citizens. Because the Panama Canal Authority is legally and ethically bound to prioritize water quality for human consumption over commercial operations, the use of these magnificent, expensive water-saving basins must be strictly and immediately curtailed during extreme dry spells. The canal's most sophisticated, expensive defense mechanism against drought suddenly becomes completely unusable at the exact moment it is needed the most. To forcefully counter this terrifying salt invasion, authorities have had to resort to truly bizarre, temporary measures, like slurping up fresh water with a gigantic metaphorical straw exactly at the mouth of the Chagres River, and then piping it 15 kilometers away to treatment plants located in the high salinity areas. There are long-term, ambitious plans to build new, advanced water treatment plants specifically to handle the salinity, but until those are fully complete, the canal remains helplessly caught in a bizarre, deeply ironic feedback loop, where saving water actively risks poisoning the local population. It is the absolute ultimate engineering irony. The genius solution creates a massive, whole new problem. Faced with a drying lake, a furiously angry shipping industry, and salty drinking water, the authorities have been frantically weighing a series of potential fixes ranging from the highly experimental to the massive and deeply disruptive. One of the more science fiction approaches openly discussed is cloud seeding. In late 2023, a small plane operated by North Dakota-based Weather Modification Inc. arrived down in Panama to explicitly test the process of implanting large salt particles directly into clouds to artificially boost the condensation that creates rain. While cloud seeding has been practiced with varying degrees of enthusiasm since the 1940s, its actual effectiveness remains a subject of fierce, ongoing debate among scientists, with comprehensive studies offering deeply mixed results. Furthermore, cloud seeding has mostly been deployed with some minor success in very dry, arid climates, and deploying it effectively in a wet, tropical country like Panama presents entirely unproven, unique challenges. Most serious engineers agree that cloud seeding is definitely not a magical silver bullet that will somehow solve the massive structural water shortages of the canal. The primary, highly ambitious long-term solution heavily pushed by the Panama Canal Authority is the Indio River Reservoir Project. This massive, sprawling endeavor involves an estimated investment of $1.6 billion. The goal is to build a massive new dam directly on the Indio River, to explicitly create a brand new artificial lake to store even more fresh water. To actually get this new water to where it is desperately needed, engineers propose aggressively drilling a massive 9-kilometer tunnel straight through a mountain to let the water flow naturally by gravity directly into Gatun Lake. The projected capacity boost from this monumental effort would theoretically allow for 12 to 15 additional daily transits, significantly supplementing the Gatun Lake water supply. While the engineering behind the Indio River project is completely sound and perfectly mirrors the exact gravity-fed logic that made the original canal successful a century ago, the human and environmental costs are staggering. The massive project will forcefully require the permanent resettlement of approximately 500 families, or roughly 2,000 people, who currently depend on subsistence agriculture across small communities in the river basin. Unsurprisingly, this enormous disruption has triggered fierce, passionate opposition from local peasant organizations and dedicated environmental groups, who strongly argue that the dam will violently devastate local biodiversity and displace rural communities without any adequate consultation. A passionate coalition known as the Coordinadora Campesina por la Vida officially filed a major lawsuit before the Supreme Court, directly challenging the constitutionality of the massive project, leaving its future timeline in a state of extremely high uncertainty. While the fierce court battles and endless engineering studies continue for the Indio River Dam, another completely massive project is being aggressively explored to move cargo without relying on a single drop of water at all: a land bridge. The Panama Canal Authority has confidently unveiled massive plans for a proposed overland infrastructure project aimed at seamlessly handling an incredible additional 5 million containers annually by the year 2045. The land bridge concept relies on efficiently moving containers completely off massive ships at a busy port on one coast, carefully loading them onto massive trains or loud trucks, actively moving them across the 75-kilometer isthmus, and then rapidly loading them onto another completely different ship waiting on the opposite coast. The estimated investment for this massive proposed land bridge is roughly $1.2 to $1.4 billion. This short-haul overland service allows major shipping lines to efficiently reposition containers between the Atlantic and Pacific without aggressively paying massive canal tolls or risking entirely unpredictable delays during the harsh dry seasons. For instance, the major shipping line Maersk has already actively utilized the existing rail service as a clever strategy to reposition containers, particularly because many of its massive ships sitting on the Pacific side are entirely too large to physically enter the canal locks at all. However, this land bridge is certainly not a perfect, seamless substitute. It generally takes several grueling days to actively offload, transport, and reload massive volumes of cargo, and many shipping lines have historically been incredibly hesitant to firmly embrace the operational complexity of a sustained, permanent land bridge service. Shippers strongly prefer the smooth, uninterrupted, easy journey of an all-water route, but the harsh, undeniable climate reality is violently forcing them to accept that a multimodal, complicated approach may be the absolute only way forward. The Panama Canal currently stands at a profound, historic crossroads, actively grappling with the incredible, undeniable paradox of a tropical rainforest rapidly running out of water. For the very first time in human history, a highly localized drought has successfully succeeded in violently slowing down the unstoppable juggernaut of global maritime trade, forcefully causing massive, painful delays and fiercely costing shipping companies millions upon millions of dollars in premium, line-jumping auction fees. The core mechanisms of the canal, the brilliant, gravity-fed locks that smoothly move massive ships 85 feet over a continental divide, remain an absolute masterpiece of human engineering. But they are entirely dependent on a finite, fragile supply of fresh water that extreme climate change and unpredictable El Niño events have rendered increasingly unreliable. The absolute highlight, and perhaps the darkest joke, of this entire crisis remains the stunning, deeply counterintuitive revelation regarding the Neo-Panamax locks. The highly advanced, very expensive water-saving basins, carefully designed to recycle 60% of the fresh water used in each transit, ended up aggressively concentrating dense ocean saltwater and violently pushing it directly into Gatun Lake. The ultimate, crushing paradox is that the very shiny technology, actively built to keep the canal gracefully operating during extreme droughts, directly risks poisoning the absolute primary source of drinking water for over half of the country's entire population. Because the Panama Canal Authority is legally, morally, and ethically bound to firmly prioritize water quality for human consumption over lucrative commercial operations, this absolutely brilliant sustainable solution simply must be switched off at the exact moment it is most desperately needed. The future of the canal will absolutely require a deeply delicate balancing act. Whether Panama bravely chooses to push forward with the $1.6 billion Indio River Reservoir, despite the incredibly heavy social and legal opposition, or if they decide to pivot heavily to the dry, cumbersome land bridge concept, the glorious era of simply taking fresh water for granted in the tropics is officially, permanently over. Global trade will forcefully continue to adapt to these rapidly shifting realities, proving once and for all that even the absolute most massive, imposing steel ships on the ocean are ultimately, completely at the mercy of the natural water cycle. Conserving nature is no longer just a polite environmental talking point. It is the absolute ultimate linchpin holding up the massive, endlessly interconnected network of international commerce. Think deeply about this incredible paradox. If you were in charge of the entire Panama Canal operation right now, would you prioritize moving the world's incredibly lucrative cargo through the massive locks, or would you strictly focus on fiercely protecting the vital drinking water and the local, agricultural communities living in the Indio River Basin? Let us know down in the comments, because there are no easy answers here. Thanks for listening and watching. Please like and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos about the global supply chain.